Let's thank all the panelists as a group. Now, I will be recognizing questioners, and please do not speak until you have your mic and identify yourself. Yes, that gentleman there.
This is for Tom Wysmuller. In January of this year, I'm Ken Hoppler with SEP. In January, NOAA came out with a great new study on sea level rise in the United States that stated that along the East Coast, we can expect sea level rise by 2100 to be up to 8.2 feet above what it is now. Would you care to talk about the science behind NOAA's remarkable finding?
Well, you're right about remarkable. First of all, there are parts of the East Coast that are experiencing subsidence, but nowhere near what's talking. Those numbers you're talking about, Ken, came straight out of that National Climate Assessment. And the new one, I've seen the draft, is just as bad. I think the Trump administration has to just pull it because there is false information involved.
I think in response to that, we ought to say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and they haven't presented the evidence.
Right. I'm Brian Bishop from Rhode Island, and actually, just as a point of order on that, I read the study because the headline said it said 9 feet. That was actually the extreme possibility that they recommended for planning for power plants. So that's been large, not that I trust the NOAA study, but it's been grossly mischaracterized in the press. And Susan, I was wondering, understanding that you've done this work and that you think there are other biologists who recognize, why polar bears may have gone down in one area and may see generally what's happening. Is there any possibility, and we saw a discourse among, economists on the social cost of carbon that I think was at least friendly. They weren't people that necessarily all shared a political outlook or a goal on carbon, but at least they had a reasonable debate about what was going on. Do you have any sense that there are other, thoughtful biologists who, maybe have tried to formulate responses or ideas about why the model didn't work, and who may still be worried but are at least willing to have a discourse with you?
Well, part of the difficulty, I think, is that the field of polar bear biology is so small and incestuous, and has been since its inception in the 1960s. And so it's a small group to begin with. They all have their loyalties to a few leaders who have been in place for decades, and that makes it a very difficult mold to break out of. And I don't know how many of you heard about one dissenter within their group who just expressed some concerns about relying on climate models. This is someone with the Polar Bear Specialist Group. Before the next meeting, he was told he was no longer welcome. Now, that response, to my mind, that tells all the graduate students, all the young researchers, you watch your step. That's the line. You cross over it, you're not going to work in this field again. They've been warned. They know what they can and can't say, and so they're essentially muzzled, or they won't work in the field again.
Yes, Steve Hines. How did NOAA and NASA become so politicized, and is there a date where you can say they sort of went off the tracks?
Wow. NASA itself hasn't been that politicized. The GISS unit up at Columbia has been. And in my view, they have basically hijacked the reputation of the agency and used that to promote their own alarmist agenda. But the rest of the agency still has some real heroes in it, some people who really want to see a viable space program with real exploration, real satellite gathering data, maybe going to Mars or Phobos, lots of things we can do. The agency is still intact, and I think with new leadership, it's going to get better.
I also think we can't. we can't rule out blaming the Russians.
White tie.
My question's for Susan. It was intriguing what you said about the thickening of the ice, diminishing polar bear numbers. What sort of studies have been, the obvious question to ask is what happened during the glaciations and that, because it seems like polar bears actually suffer when there's too much ice. So has there been any study of distributions during the last ice age which indicates maybe what the optimum temperature of the polar bears are?
Well, the difficulty is that there are no records, essentially, in terms of polar bear fossils, there are 6 that exist prior to the start of the Holocene. So that makes it very problematic to try and get at anything. However, we do have a little bit of evidence, and it comes from genetics. And that is showing us that during the last interglacial that was warmer than it is today, that there was a very slight decline in polar bear numbers, at least that's what the genetics seems to be showing us, but that coincident with the last glacial maximum, so say about 14,000 years ago, there was a major drop, a major bottleneck, a drop in population. So that would seem to suggest that, as for the thick sea ice in the spring example that we've got in modern times, that in fact really cold conditions are harder for polar bears to get through than warmer.
Yeah.
Hi, Larry Gould. I have a question for Susan Crockford. In the Al Gore film Inconvenient Truth, there's a polar bear that's struggling to get on an ice floe but doesn't succeed. I think the film may have been in 2007. In 2006, if I recall, there was an article in Polar Biology by Monette and Gleason.
Yes.
And they talk about drowned bears as a result of the storm. And then near the end of the article, in pops some speculation about possible connection to global warming. So I was wondering, number one, whether that may have been picked up by the Gore people making the film. And the other thing is, if I recall correctly, polar bears can swim about 65 miles in the open water. So that seems to also go against the problem about getting onto the ice floes.
Well, in response to your second comment, in fact, it's much further than that. It's like hundreds of miles they can swim. And in fact, one of the difficulties is that there has been the deaths by drowning issue that certainly has hit the activist organization has taken up. Al Gore certainly did pick it up. And the other one is cannibalism. You know, they're going to start eating each other because they're so desperately hungry. And there was another one. And the hybridization, I suppose. But the difficulty is, particularly for the cannibalism and for the drowning deaths, realistically, for drowning, there's no data to compare it to. There's no baseline, so no one knows how many polar bears a year in any one region die by drowning. We do know that cannibalism is an ongoing issue for polar bear, for all bears. It always has been. And in fact, but nobody has done actually a scientific study. So what they're doing is they're taking individual incidents and blowing them out of proportion and making them sound like science, but they are not. And that's why we do science, is so that we can get away from taking an isolated incident and trying to attach extraordinary meaning to it. And instead we look at longer term, bigger picture things, and we look at what happened in the past and we look at what happened recently, and then we can make an informed decision on what kind of trend there might be. But for deaths by drowning particularly, and for cannibalism, there is no science associated with those claims.
Do we have time for another question? Okay, one more question.
All right, for the risk manager,
What came out of those stacks?
What come out of those stacks?
Yes,
Mostly what you're saying is water vapor.
yes.
Um,
But you were talking about all the bad things that came out of the stacks. Second question is,
well, there's also some nitrogen oxides, a little bit of particulate, a little bit of this
Little
and
bit.
that. Yeah.
the second question is, do you really believe that small particulates are killers? And the third one is, what's your position with regards to the issue of using the precautionary principle as the guide for risk management?
I believe that the risk associated with small particulate is far overblown. I believe that the data shows that. But of course, when we deal with most environmental groups, they don't really care about data. They want to talk about why you said what you said, not what you said. So I've been accused of, taking money from ExxonMobil so many times, and I'm still waiting for my first check. So if there's any representatives out there, please send it to me. And I'm sorry, what was the last part of your question?
The precautionary principle.
Oh, the precautionary, that's silly. I mean, if we followed the precautionary principle to its ultimate conclusion, we would all be cowering in our homes, right? Because that's the safest possible thing to do. We need to think about risk logically. We need to think about risk and reward. That's what built this country. And we got a generation that we have to convince to get back to that model.
We got time for one more question, probably. We won't fit in.
Somebody behind you, I think. Oh.
Hi, this question is for you, Susan. My name is Debbie Butchkalippi, and I work with J.D. King on the movie Blue. We were doing a documentary called Ice Bear, in which you were featured in it, and we did not get enough Kickstarter funding for it. Of our $100,000, we could only raise $13,000 in this short month. Has anybody approached you with an idea for a documentary on your research?
I've had a couple of people just approaching me, but nothing has ever come of it. So I think as you're indicating that it's probably lack of funding that's prevented some of these ideas from going ahead.
That's it.
Thank you very much.